June 1944, Normandy. Within mere hours, German commanders processed 2 intelligence dispatches. British paratroopers had descended east of the Ore River. American airborne divisions had infiltrated inland from Utah Beach. Both represented elite formations. Both had drilled for years. Both carried the finest armaments their nations could manufacture. Yet within 48 hours, German officers issued vastly divergent evaluations of the 2 dangers. A dispatch from the 21st Panzer Division characterized the British paratroopers with striking alarm. Exceptionally lethal, rigidly controlled, utterly impossible to expel. A separate dispatch from formations confronting the American 1st and 82nd Airborne employed contrasting terminology. Fragmented, chaotic, ferocious, yet foreseeable. This wasn't a divergence in valor or competence. It was something deeper. Something the Germans had absorbed through bloodshed. To Wehrmacht veterans who had engaged both British and American airborne formations, the distinction was unmistakable. American paratroopers waged combat like marauders, audacious, thunderous, and devastating when they concentrated their strength. British paratroopers waged combat like phantoms, soundless, methodical, horrifying in their refusal to conduct themselves like soldiers were expected to conduct themselves. German infantry discovered rapidly which insertion zones to circumvent and which they could challenge. They discovered which paratroopers would protect the terrain unto death and which would retreat under relentless pressure. This distinction wasn't fabricated by propaganda. It wasn't molded by national bias. It crystallized from battlefield experience inscribed in death tallies, operational journals, and the hushed exchanges of soldiers who outlived encounters with both. The Germans honored American airborne troops. They were courageous, superbly armed, and perilous in favorable conditions. But the British paratroopers were something divergent, something that didn't conform to any established classification of menace. By the conflict's conclusion, German veterans who had battled against both formations frequently articulated the same observation. The Americans proclaimed themselves. The British merely materialized. And in the merciless calculus of airborne combat, where paratroopers descended isolated, vastly outnumbered, and struggling for existence, the distinction signified everything. The inquiry wasn't which formation was superior. The inquiry was which formation the Germans dreaded more, and the response documented in their own testimony was undeniable. 1940 to 1943. Before the Germans dreaded British paratroopers, they misconstrued them completely. When Britain assembled its first airborne formations in 1940, intelligence dismissed them as a desperate maneuver. Britain had collapsed in France. Its military had been degraded at Dunkirk. The notion that the British would establish an elite paratrooper formation seemed almost absurd. An endeavor to replicate German achievement without comprehending what rendered German Fallschirmjäger so devastating. German airborne formation the Fallschirmjäger had validated themselves in the conflict's early years. They had captured bridges in Holland. They had overtaken Belgian fortifications. They had conquered Crete in one of the most brazen airborne operations in military history. To German strategists, paratroopers were assault troops engineered for swift, violent capture of targets, then immediate extraction or reinforcement by standard forces. The doctrine was German. The mastery was German. Everyone else was merely copying. So when British paratroopers began manifesting in limited raids along the French coastline in 1941 and 1942, German defenders regarded them as anomalies, valiant, certainly well-drilled, perhaps, but ultimately foreseeable. A British paratrooper was presumed to be a commando inserted from an aircraft instead of transported by vessel. Hazardous in small concentrations, controllable once detected, and nothing that necessitated exceptional measures to neutralize. This evaluation persisted for nearly 2 years. British raids were analyzed, fatalities calculated, and intelligence documented. German coastal fortifications advanced, adapted to the prospect of airborne infiltration, but the danger was classified as contained. Paratroopers couldn't maintain terrain without reinforcement. They couldn't transport heavy armament. They were vulnerable once exposed. Standard Wehrmacht protocol would be adequate to eliminate them. Then arrived in November 1942, Operation Biting, a strike on a German radar installation at Bruneval. British paratroopers descended in blackness, captured the installation, seized vital equipment, and withdrew by ocean before German reinforcements materialized. The operation consumed hours. The implementation was immaculate, and the post-action dispatches from German commanders possessed a different character. Apprehension. This wasn't a raid. It was surgery. Exact, deliberate, performed with a precision that didn't correspond with the perception of British desperation. A German officer who reached Bruneville immediately after the British vanished recorded in his journal, "They were present and departed before we comprehended what had transpired." This was not fortune. This was preparation. But Bruneville was minor, a solitary raid. Surely, German commanders rationalized, British paratroopers couldn't expand this precision to larger operations. Surely, when confronting sustained combat, they would revert to the same weaknesses all airborne formations endured. Surely, they were still merely commandos with parachutes. The Germans, assured in their assumptions, anticipated the British would validate them. They would not have to anticipate long. But the validation would proceed in the contrary trajectory. What the Germans didn't recognize, what they had no means of recognizing, was that British airborne formations weren't copying German Fallschirmjäger. They were constructing something wholly divergent. A force engineered not for spectacular assaults, but for soundless endurance, not for distinction, but for maintaining terrain no one else could maintain. The British had absorbed lessons from Dunkirk. They had absorbed lessons from defeat. And they had constructed an airborne force that embodied those lessons. Silent, obstinate, lethal. The Germans were about to discover precisely how lethal. May 1943, Sicily. This was where the German conception of British paratroopers began to transform from dismissal to alarm. Operation Ladbroke. British glider troops were assigned to capture the Ponte Grande Bridge near Syracuse before Italian and German defenders could demolish it. On parchment, the operation should have collapsed catastrophically. Most of the gliders missed their insertion zones, plummeting into the ocean or scattering across the landscape. Less than 100 British troops actually secured the bridge. They were supposed to be relieved within hours. Instead, they maintained their position for nearly a complete day. German dispatches from Sicily characterized something unanticipated. The British paratroopers, enormously outnumbered, declined to capitulate. They didn't attempt a fighting extraction. They didn't wait passively for reinforcement. They maintained the bridge with an obstinacy that bewildered Italian troops and confounded German reinforcements attempting to recapture the position. Even after ammunition depleted, even after casualties accumulated, the British maintained position. When they were finally overwhelmed, it was only minutes before Allied ground formations arrived to reclaim the bridge permanently. A German liaison officer with Italian formations documented, "The English paratroopers combat as if withdrawal is not in their lexicon. 70 men maintained a bridge against a battalion. This is not rational conduct." But to the British, it was wholly rational. The assignment was to maintain the bridge. So they maintained it. The concept of relinquishing an objective because it became arduous simply didn't enter the calculation. This wasn't heroism in the spectacular sense. It was obligation executed with frigid mechanical discipline. Then arrived the larger airborne operations later in the Sicily campaign and into Italy. British paratroopers began manifesting in locations German defenders considered unreachable by air, descending into mountainous terrain, landing in valleys German intelligence presumed were too treacherous for airborne assault. And once on terrain, instead of seeking to connect rapidly with standard forces, British paras frequently operated autonomously for days, striking supply routes, ambushing patrols, and generating chaos far behind German defensive perimeters. What disturbed German commanders was the autonomy. American paratroopers, when inserted behind hostile perimeters, typically sought to consolidate, assemble larger formations, and advance toward their objectives with strength. British paratroopers seemed comfortable remaining dispersed. Small teams functioning alone, manifesting, striking, and evaporating before German formations could organize a response. They waged combat more like insurgents than like soldiers. A captured German officer interrogated after being ambushed by British paras in Italy articulated his exasperation. "We recognized they were in the sector. We dispatched patrols. We discovered nothing. Then at nightfall, they assaulted our headquarters. 6 men. 6. They annihilated our vehicles, eliminated sentries, and evaporated. We never observed them again. This wasn't the airborne combat German protocol had prepared for. This was something approximating guerrilla techniques executed by elite troops with preparation and equipment far surpassing what insurgents possessed. By late 1943, Wehrmacht intelligence had revised its evaluations. British paratroopers were no longer characterized as commandos with parachutes. They were designated as high-priority dangers. Formations encountering them were counseled to engage with vigilance. German soldiers reviewing these revised briefings began to comprehend something their commanders were hesitant to articulate explicitly. The British had established a force that was genuinely hazardous. Not because it was larger or better armed, but because it waged combat in methods the Wehrmacht hadn't encountered before. The genuine test, the moment that would cement German dread of British paratroopers, was still approaching. And it would transpire on a moonless night over Normandy at a pair of bridges the Germans believed were unreachable to capture by airborne assault. June 6, 1944, just after midnight, Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge, two vital crossings over the Curragh Canal and Arnhem River. German defenders, veteran troops from the 736th Grenadier Regiment, occupied bunkers and machine gun emplacements covering both bridges. They had been instructed to anticipate paratroopers on D-Day. They had established mines, wire, interlocking fields of fire. The bridges were considered impregnable. Then in absolute silence, 3 British Horsa gliders descended within meters of Pegasus Bridge. No alarm, no engine noise, merely the sound of wood and metal sliding across grass. Within 90 seconds, British paratroopers from D Company, 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry had stormed both bridges, eliminated or captured the defenders, and secured the crossings intact. The entire assault consumed less than 10 minutes. A German machine gunner, one of the few survivors of the initial assault, later characterized the attack. We detected nothing. No aircraft, no parachutes. Then abruptly they were upon us, firing grenades, shouting in English. We had no time to react, no time to demolish the bridges. They were specialists. This wasn't fortune. This wasn't crushing strength. This was precision so refined, it appeared supernatural. What stunned German commanders reviewing the assault wasn't merely the success, it was the methodology. British pilots had descended gliders at night within 50 meters of their targets. British infantry had performed a synchronized assault with grenade, small arms, and close combat that overwhelmed prepared fortifications before reinforcements could respond. And most critically, the British maintained position for hours against counteroffensives by German armor and infantry that should have driven them back across the river. The 21st Panzer Division, assigned with recapturing the bridges, dispatched multiple probing attacks throughout the morning of June 6. Each was repulsed. British paratroopers entrenched into positions around the bridges, fought with a cohesion and discipline that didn't correspond with their situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, severed from reinforcements. Yet they maintained position. A German tank commander whose Panzer IV was disabled by a British PIAT team near Pegasus Bridge recorded bitterly in his journal. They should have been overwhelmed. They had no anti-tank weapons, no artillery reinforcement, merely infantry with small arms. Yet every time we advanced, they halted us. How? The response lay in preparation, in command, and in something more difficult to quantify. British paratroopers had been conditioned to perceive their objectives as non-negotiable. Withdrawal wasn't an option considered in strategizing. If commanded to maintain position, they maintained position. By the conclusion of D-Day, when British ground formations finally connected with the paratroopers at Pegasus Bridge, the strategic situation in Normandy had been fundamentally shaped by that 10-minute assault. The bridges, intact and under Allied dominion, allowed British armor to advance inland without delay. German counteroffensives, which might have driven the invasion back into the ocean, were delayed by hours, then days, because those 2 crossings remained in British possession. But for the German soldiers who confronted the British at Pegasus Bridge, the tactical details mattered less than the psychological impact. These paratroopers hadn't merely prevailed. They had made it appear effortless. They had descended into the darkness, captured impossible objectives, and maintained them against everything the Wehrmacht could deploy against them. This was the moment German respect transformed into something darker. Dread. June to August 1944, Normandy. While British paratroopers carved their reputation into the German consciousness at Pegasus Bridge, American airborne formations were conducting their own operations merely miles away. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended inland from Utah and Omaha beaches assigned with securing key routes, towns, and causeways. And the German response to these American insertions was markedly divergent from their response to the British. This wasn't because American paratroopers were less valiant or less competent. The 82nd and 101st were elite formations, volunteers all with preparation that rivaled any airborne force in the world. They fought with intensity and resolve. They accomplished their objectives. They earned honor from every German formation that encountered them. But the manner the Germans perceived the American danger was fundamentally divergent from how they perceived the British. American insertions were scattered. This was partly due to hostile weather, partly due to German anti-aircraft fire, partly due to the chaos inherent in night jumps over hostile territory. But the outcome was foreseeable. American paratroopers trained to function in large cohesive formations found themselves isolated in small groups across the Norman countryside. They adapted. They assembled ad hoc formations. They assaulted with the resources they possessed. But their techniques by necessity became reactive rather than surgical. German defenders confronting American airborne troops discovered rapidly that the danger arrived in successive waves. First scattered groups of paratroopers generating confusion, then larger consolidated formations advancing toward objectives. Finally, connection with standard forces breaking out from the beaches. The pattern was readable, comprehensible. German commanders could strategize defenses around it. A dispatch from the 91st Luftland Division, which confronted both American and British airborne formations in Normandy, documented the contrast explicitly. The Americans combat with tremendous courage and aggression. When they assault in strength. When they consolidate, they become easier to detect and contain. The British, by contrast, remain dispersed even when organized. We cannot anticipate where they will strike next. This wasn't a condemnation of American techniques. It was an observation about operational protocol. American airborne formations were trained to concentrate combat strength, to mass firepower, to overwhelm positions through coordinated assaults. This succeeded. It accomplished objectives, but it also rendered them visible. German intelligence could track American paratroopers by following their concentration points. Where American formations gathered, German forces could respond with artillery, counteroffensives, and reinforcements. British paratroopers functioned differently. Even when multiple companies were in the same sector, they rarely concentrated in obvious methods. Instead, they maintained dispersed positions, interlocking fields of fire, and flexible defensive networks that German probes couldn't easily map. A German patrol might encounter a British outpost, engage it, drive it back, and presume the sector was clear. Hours later, another British team would assault from a completely divergent direction. The psychological impact on German soldiers was distinct. Fighting American airborne troops felt like fighting an aggressive, well-equipped adversary who operated by recognizable conventions. Fighting British paratroopers felt like fighting shadows. A German sergeant from the 346th Infantry Division characterized it plainly. The Americans we can observe. We recognize where they are. We recognize what they will do. The British, we never recognize. They are soundless until they eliminate you. This wasn't about which force was superior. It was about which force conformed to German tactical comprehension and which didn't. American airborne operations followed patterns German officers had studied, strategized for, and understood how to neutralize. British operations defied those patterns, generating a persistent low-level anxiety among German troops who never recognized when or where British paratroopers might manifest next. By late summer 1944, German formations in Normandy had developed informal protocols based on experience. When confronting American paratroopers, commit reserves, concentrate firepower, and press the assault. When confronting British paratroopers, probe cautiously, circumvent isolated advances, and never presume a sector is secure merely because it appears vacant. The Americans commanded respect. The British commanded dread, and the distinction inscribed in blood across the fields of Normandy shaped how German soldiers approached every subsequent encounter with Allied airborne formations. September 1944, Operation Market Garden, Arnhem. This was the operation that transformed German dread of British paratroopers from respect into something approaching awe. The strategy was audacious to the point of folly. British 1st Airborne Division would descend near Arnhem, capture the bridge over the Rhine, and maintain it until XXX Corps arrived with armor and reinforcements. Intelligence indicated light German resistance. The reality was catastrophic. The British descended directly into two SS Panzer divisions, refitting in the sector. 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, elite German formations, experienced, superbly equipped, rested. The British paratroopers were outnumbered, outgunned, and severed almost immediately. By every measure of military logic, the operation should have concluded in hours with total British capitulation. It persisted 9 days. German commanders observing British paratroopers combat in Arnhem witnessed something they hadn't observed before, a complete refusal to acknowledge reality. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion captured the northern end of Arnhem Bridge and maintained it for 4 days against overwhelming German assaults. They exhausted ammunition. They exhausted medical provisions. They exhausted food. German tanks pounded their positions at point-blank range. SS infantry assaulted repeatedly, absorbing horrific casualties. The British maintained position. A German officer from the 9th SS Panzer Division recorded in his combat dispatch, "We have fought the British in France, in Belgium, in Holland. We have never observed this. They maintain buildings that are burning around them. They combat from cellars after the floors above have collapsed. They fire until they have no bullets. Then they throw stones. This is not normal warfare." What confounded German forces at Arnhem wasn't merely the British refusal to capitulate. It was their continued tactical effectiveness even in hopeless situations. British snipers isolated in buildings surrounded by German troops continued eliminating targets with such accuracy that German commanders presumed they were confronting far more paratroopers than were actually present. British mortar teams down to their last rounds fired with precision that disrupted German assembly sectors time and again. The Germans deployed everything at Arnhem. Tanks, artillery, flamethrowers, SS infantry conducting building-to-building clearances, and still the British maintained sections of the town, inflicting casualties, denying terrain, making the Germans compensate for every meter. When Frost's battalion was finally overwhelmed at the bridge, German troops discovered fewer than 200 British paratroopers still capable of fighting. They had maintained a bridge against 2 panzer divisions with a force the size of a solitary company. But the genuine shock arrived in the days that followed. The remainder of 1st Airborne, trapped in a shrinking perimeter in Austerbeek, continued fighting. German intelligence estimated British strength at several thousand. In reality, fewer than 1,500 paratroopers were still combat effective. Yet the perimeter maintained position. German assaults were repulsed. British artillery firing across the Rhine from XXX Corps positions coordinated with forward observers who were literally surrounded by German forces still calling inaccurate fire. A captured SS officer interrogated after the battle expressed something approximating exasperation. "We anticipated them to capitulate on the 2nd day, then the 3rd, then the 4th. They never capitulated. We had to eliminate or capture them one by one. Even their wounded fought. Even their medical personnel fought when their positions were overwhelmed. We claimed the town, but we did not defeat them. They simply exhausted men." By the time British survivors evacuated across the Rhine on the night of September 25, German respect for British paratroopers had solidified into something permanent. The operation was a failure. The bridge wasn't maintained. Market Garden collapsed. But the Germans hadn't prevailed at Arnhem. They had survived it. And every German soldier who fought there comprehended the distinction. American airborne formations had fought courageously in Market Garden, too. The 101st and 82nd secured their objectives, maintained their bridges, fought effectively, but they weren't trapped. They weren't surrounded. They weren't asked to maintain impossible positions for 9 days with no prospect of reinforcement. The comparison was unjust, and German veterans recognized it. But the psychological impact remained. The British at Arnhem had accomplished something the Germans couldn't explain. They had refused to lose even when losing was the only rational outcome. And that refusal, that absolute obstinacy in the face of annihilation, made them horrifying in a manner even elite SS troops struggled to articulate. 1944 to 1945. By the final year of the conflict, German perceptions of British and American airborne formations had crystallized into a clear, if uncomfortable, distinction. Both were elite. Both were hazardous. But when German commanders strategized defenses, when soldiers whispered in foxholes about what they dreaded most, the two formations occupied divergent categories of danger. American paratroopers were honored. German troops recognized that encountering the 82nd or 101st meant confronting well-trained, aggressive soldiers who would combat hard for their objectives. But American techniques were comprehensible. They concentrated strength. They assaulted with artillery reinforcement when possible. They followed recognizable patterns of advance and consolidation. A German officer with experience in defensive combat could strategize for American airborne operations. He might not prevail, but he could anticipate. British paratroopers, by contrast, remained unpredictable. They functioned in methods that defied German doctrinal expectations. Small teams that operated independently for days. Defensive positions that refused to collapse, even under overwhelming firepower. Assaults that arrived from unanticipated angles at unanticipated times with unanticipated strength. German soldiers couldn't eliminate the sensation that British paratroopers were always observing, always waiting, always one step ahead. This perception was reinforced by operational outcomes. When American airborne formations absorbed casualties or confronted setbacks, they withdrew, regrouped, and assaulted again with standard forces. This was sound military practice. It preserved lives and ensured objectives were eventually secured, but it also meant German defenders could anticipate the rhythm of American operations. British paratroopers, more frequently than not, didn't withdraw. They maintained position until relieved or until annihilated. At Pegasus Bridge, they maintained position for hours. At Arnhem, they maintained position for days. In smaller operations across northwest Europe, British paras routinely accepted casualties that American protocol would have considered unsustainable, all to maintain positions that should have been relinquished. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculation. British airborne commanders comprehended that their greatest weapon wasn't firepower or numbers. It was the psychological impact of simply refusing to depart. A German veteran interviewed decades after the conflict characterized the distinction bluntly. Fighting the American paratroopers was like fighting a bear. Hazardous, powerful, but you comprehended what it would do. Fighting the British was like fighting a wolf. Silent, methodical. It waited for you to commit a mistake. Then it tore your throat out. The equipment both formations carried was similar. The preparation was comparable. The courage was equal. But the operational philosophy was fundamentally divergent. American airborne protocol emphasized concentration of strength and rapid connection with standard formations. British protocol emphasized dispersion, independence, and prolonged operations behind hostile perimeters. Neither was superior in absolute terms, but from the German perspective, the British approach was far more disturbing. By 1945, German troops confronting Allied airborne operations had learned to distinguish between the two formations by sound, by techniques, by sensation. American insertions were proclaimed by the roar of C-47s flying in formation, by paratroopers descending in concentrations, by the rapid construction of defensive perimeters. British insertions were quieter, gliders descending in darkness, paratroopers dispersing immediately into the terrain. An eerie absence of activity followed by abrupt violent contact. The psychological toll on German defenders was measurable. Formations that had confronted British airborne formations showed higher rates of anxiety, diminished morale, and more frequent reports of feeling surrounded even when intelligence indicated otherwise. This wasn't cowardice. It was the rational response to fighting an adversary that didn't conduct themselves rationally. The British paratroopers had weaponized unpredictability, and against an army as doctrine-focused as the Wehrmacht, unpredictability was more valuable than any amount of additional firepower. Looking back, The inquiry of why Germans dreaded British paratroopers more than American airborne troops isn't about comparing courage, skill, or effectiveness. Both formations were elite. Both accomplished their objectives more frequently than not. Both earned the honor of every adversary they confronted. The distinction lay not in what they accomplished, but in how they accomplished it and what that signified for the soldiers fighting against them. American paratroopers fought like an elite standard force inserted behind hostile perimeters. They were aggressive, well-coordinated, resolute. They followed protocol that emphasized massing combat strength and accomplishing objectives through superior firepower and maneuver. This rendered them hazardous. It rendered them effective, but it also rendered them foreseeable. German commanders could interpret American operations, strategize responses, and combat them using established defensive principles. British paratroopers fought like something else entirely. They didn't mass. They dispersed. They didn't rush toward objectives. They stalked them. They didn't retreat when logic demanded it. They maintained position until physically incapable of maintaining position longer. This violated every principle of combat the Germans comprehended. It generated a psychological effect that outlasted any tactical advantage. The Germans didn't dread British paratroopers because the British were superior soldiers. They dreaded them because the British were incomprehensible. A force that accepted casualties German troops considered suicidal. A force that maintained terrain German protocol said was indefensible. A force that functioned independently when every military manual said coordination and mass were essential. The British had established an airborne force that weaponized its own willingness to endure the unendurable. And that weapon aimed at the German psyche proved devastatingly effective. After the conflict, when German veterans were asked about their most difficult adversaries, British paratroopers manifested on those lists with startling frequency. Not because they had inflicted the most casualties, not because they had prevailed in the most battles, but because they had generated a sense of helplessness in their adversaries. You could eliminate British paratroopers. You could overwhelm their positions. You could accomplish tactical victories, but you couldn't break them. And fighting an adversary you cannot break, even when you're prevailing, is a uniquely demoralizing experience. American paratroopers earned honor through courage and effectiveness. British paratroopers earned dread through something more difficult to define. A refusal to acknowledge the limits other formations recognized. A willingness to maintain positions past the point where maintaining position made sense. A capacity for silent, methodical violence that left German troops constantly looking over their shoulders. In the end, both formations contributed enormously to Allied victory. Both deserve recognition for their sacrifices and accomplishments. But when German soldiers gathered after the conflict to share their experiences, when they spoke quietly about what they had confronted, one truth emerged consistently. The Americans they remembered as warriors. The British they remembered as phantoms. Phantoms that descended from the sky, captured impossible objectives, and refused to disappear no matter how hard you fought to make them vanish. That dread born in the darkness over Normandy, refined in the ruins of Arnhem and confirmed in 100 smaller actions across Europe, was the British paratroopers' greatest accomplishment. They didn't need to be larger than the Americans. They didn't need superior equipment or more reinforcement. They simply needed to convince the adversary that fighting them was divergent, more hazardous, more exhausting, more horrifying. And in that conviction carved into the minds of veteran Wehrmacht soldiers, the British paratroopers accomplished something that outlasted any single battle. They made themselves unforgettable.